Greetings, friends! Juan Grisky here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of August 26th through September 1st of 2024. And this week marks the first anniversary of me doing this series, so I hope you guys have been enjoying it. And this week we have a lot of updates, and it is I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Pokrovsk front for the Ukrainians has collapsed. We have not seen advances like this from the Russians since forever. I have no clue. Like, maybe this is attrition finally working. Maybe the Ukrainians do have ran out of manpower finally. But on the Pokrovsk front, things that would have taken weeks or months before are now being fallen in days. Let's take an example of Novohrodivka. Now, last week I talked about how the Russians broke through into this town. I talked about how that was a bit of a surprise. But at the time, we didn't know exactly where everyone was. However, from the time the Russians entered this town to when the Russians have fully captured this town, and when I mean fully captured, we have geolocated footage of the Russians being, I believe in this Terracon, we have geolocated footage of Russians up here. We have geolocated footage of the Russians in this area and in this southern area. We don't have some in the middle, but if they're in the north and then they're here, then it's most likely that they're also in the center. And most sources have said Novohrodivka has completely fallen to the Russians, and this is a big deal. And it fell in 4 days. So the time the Russians entered to the time the Russians fully captured, it took only 4 days. If you told me the Russians would take Novohrodivka, a pre-war town of 14,000 people, in just 4 days, I would have called you crazy. I would have thought the Russians would have took it maybe, at the very least, maybe all of September, because as we saw, the Russians have been, moving, having rapid advances for the last 3 weeks or so. So, maybe, if we were talking about this in 2023, I would have said, this would have taken maybe 2 or 3 months. And, if you told me maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, I'm like, it would take them about maybe a month to clear Novohrodivka. But no, they captured it within 4 days. And not only does this break the main Ukrainian defense line, which held the Russians back from Pokrovsk itself, but it also unhinges the defenses of Gordivka and Selydove, which we're now seeing being stormed. And so, as I mentioned, Gordivka, Novohrodivka, and Selydove was the main towns that were holding the Russians back from Pokrovsk, but those towns are now being stormed and falling. Not only has Novohrodivka has fallen, the only part of, you could say, Novohrodivka that the Ukrainians still control is this Terracon right here to the west, and the fields to the west of Novohrodivka. But the Terracons to the north of Novohrodivka have been captured by the Russians. We also have some maps confirming that Kurty Yar and Krasny Yar, along with Mykolaievka, has fallen. So these three villages that hold the defenses between Novohrodivka and Gordivka have completely fallen, and the Ukrainians have fallen back to their Pokrovsk defenses. So those are the three towns I mentioned: Gordivka, Novohrodivka, and Selydove were holding the Russians back. However, this held them back from Pokrovsk. Now, Pokrovsk itself has some defenses, and we could see that here. So first of all, this is the Pokrovsk-Minigrad area. So Pokrovsk itself is just this town right here. However, as you can see, this also is basically conjoined with the city of Minigrad, which is almost as big as Pokrovsk. I don't think it's as big, but it's a city as well. And so these two cities have to are basically conjoined, and they both kind of act as defenses with each other. So as you can see, they also have Terracon and some high-rise building areas in Minigrad in the south here. They also have some in the south here, a high-rise building section right here for Pokrovsk. But also, if you scroll down here, you could see some trenches that they built up right to the south of Minigrad. You could see this trench network right here. You could see, if you go here, you could see this other trench network right here. So, if you kind of scroll to the south here, you can see that the Ukrainians have built some trenches and some natural defenses for Pokrovsk and Minigrad, in this section right here. And so this is where the Russians are right now battling for. But they were trying to push the Russians, because now that the Russians are here, they can actually shell directly Pokrovsk and Minigrad. They are close enough that they could do that. They're hoping to hold the Russians from artillery range from Pokrovsk and Minigrad. Because Yes, they have defenses in those cities, but it would be the Ukrainians would prefer not to be battling for them because defenses could be broken up, they could be destroyed, and so it would be what they wanted was to hold the Russians back as much as possible, battling for these three towns. But now that's those towns have completely almost fallen. So, completely captured Novohrodivka and complete capture of Mykolaiv, Krasnoyar, and Korchayar. And this has basically solidified themselves. The Russians have secured themselves right on the outskirts of the first defenses of Pokrovsk and Leningrad. So the battle for this city itself, the city agglomeration itself, has basically begun. We also have to talk about going to the north here, is that we have received reports that the Russians have almost completely captured the town of Gridivka here. And so last week the Russians were on the eastern outskirts of this town, right here. However, what a lot of sources are saying that the Russians have, because of the breakthrough in Novohrodivka here, the Ukrainians kind of fell back, and Gordivka is kind of split by the Zorovka River right here. And some sources are saying that they have captured completely Gordivka, but some sources are some more neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that everything to the east of this red line around the Zorovka River, so the center of Gordivka and the eastern and the southern part, has been captured by the Russians. But this part right here, that is on the other side of the Zorovka River, is still under Ukrainian control. And as you can see, this makes sense because, as you can see, the Ukrainians have these trench defenses here, and they don't want to have the Russians have a bridgehead on the other side of the river. So Gordivka, you could say the most important part has been taken by the Russians. So the center has fallen. This is another key defense node, which allows the Russians to start getting to the east of Leningrad, but it also helps secure the flanks of the Russians who've reached the northern part of Novohrodivka. But the defenses to the north of to the northwest of Gordivka right here are still under Ukrainian control, and they have this river to help defend themselves here. So Gordivka has mostly fallen. How that happened was that the Russians were pushing to the east here, but they were getting some fierce resistance. But since the Russians were also clearing these fields to the south here, they were able to attack in a double envelopment maneuver and force the Ukrainians from the center. We also have reports, as we can see here, that the fields to the north of Gordivka, so before they were in Novohrodivka, but then they were using the Kerensky-Terezhsk River, and they basically took these fields that were to the west of Novohrodivka. And because of that, the Russians were able to attack Gordivka from the north. They were able to attack it from the south, and obviously they've been trying to attack it from the east here. And these three attacks basically forced the Ukrainians to give up Gordivka. And now the Russians have a solid defense line in the north along the Kerensky-Terezhsk River here. We also have some footage, or some not footage, but like some mappers saying that the Russians have established a small bridgehead to the north of the Novohrodivka River here. I don't know what the purpose of this is, but maybe this is to give some like space so the Ukrainians aren't like right up against the river or something. Some sources are saying the Ukrainians might want to accumulate forces in this area right here and try to attack from the north here to try to cut off the Russian logistics, but because there's no river that protects Novoalexandrivka, for example. But as we're going to discuss later on, the Russians have secured their logistics to the Pokrovsk salient. So before it was mostly to the north, which was threatened by an attack, but now they have some supplies in the south that could support them. So very big gains in Novohrodivka and Gordivka. So now the thing is that the Russians might continue trying to storm the southern part of Leningrad, maybe continue moving towards this rail line. So maybe they want to put, here's another rail line right here, and maybe the Russians want to clear this area right here, and so they can actually get to the southern part of Pokrovsk, and then also continue moving along the rail line here. And, so maybe the Russians next week will start battling for the southern part of Leningrad, start clearing the southern villages of Pokrovsk. Or the thing is, the Russians might pause here, have a new defense line along Gordivka, Novohrodivka, and focus on another area. And this is where, is in the South Donetsk area. And this is where a lot of the action has been focused on as well. The Russians might be in a, might pause because, they don't want to continue pushing here because, again, this makes the flanks more exposed. But what they have been doing is trying to secure their southern flank here, and this is where a lot of the action and a lot of the big action is taking place here. This is one of the first times where, we always talk about these different fronts in this war, but what we don't see is like how these fronts interact with each other. So this is the first time in a long while where one front is directly affecting the progress in another front. So the Pokrovsk front is now affecting the South Donetsk area, and the South Donetsk area is like, this area right here. And the reason why is because the Russians the Ukrainians, were thinking they're going to have to hold off the Russians directly from here. So they have their defenses along the Vlchka River and Karakova, but they weren't expecting the Russians to attack them from the south here. And so the Russians are pushing here and slowly creating a cauldron for the Ukrainians that are defending in Krasnogorivka and Novolsky. And, if the Russians continue pushing without being stopped, they could reach right to the south here and cut off Karakova, and this entire area will be cut off. And then the Ukrainians that are in Ugledar and all that will be in very big trouble. So this is one of the first times in this war where once the front line stabilized, where one front affects what happens in another area. So let's talk about what happened. So the most major thing that happened this week is that the battle for Selydove has started. So these two towns, Grigor and Novohrodivka, have completely been captured. Selydove is still under Ukrainian control, but the battle for it has started. So what happened? We got geolocated footage of the Russians being in control of this Terrakon right here, and most maps have said that this second Terrakon has been captured by the Russians. Along with this, while we don't, again, it's a bit spotty. According to what we have by the end of this week, the Ukrainians have fell back to the center of Selydove and are using these high-rise buildings right here as their main defense line right here. Because if these falls, then the rest of Selydove will fall pretty quickly. However, everything to the east of that, so in the north here, the Russians have captured what they call the Avangard Stadium. So you can see the stadium. So this kind of area right here to the west of the second Terrakon, they say, is where the Russians are right now securing themselves. We also have some foot saying in the south here that the Russians have captured the hospital right here. And so, the Russians have basically moved all the way up to the first, the high-rise building areas, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold this with all their might. A lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are finally pulling reserves to the Pokrovsk area from Ugledar, from Kursk, and so we might not see Selydove fall as quickly as Novohrodivka. So, because once they started sending reserves here, we're now seeing, instead of a rapid collapse, we're starting to see a small, a more typical fighting, but as we would see in the last few years in this war. So. But I think Selydove will fall sometime this month, maybe within 3-4 weeks. And once that happens, because right now the Russians are now battling for the high-rise buildings, and a lot of the natural defenses that held the Russians back were captured very quickly. So the Ukrainians lost a lot of their advantages. They still have the possibility to hold on to Selydove for a bit longer, but most of the eastern part of Selydove has fallen. And once Selydove falls, Selydove is the gateway to opening up the Russians to reaching the Karakova. Because as you can see, the Russians, once they take Selydove, could reach this highway, this rail line, and then like they did moving towards Pokrovsk, they could move south here, and then cut off Ukrainska, and then reach this little village of Tazuska, and this splits in two. And they'll continue moving along this rail line until they reach right here, and the rail line ends right to the north of Karakova. And this would cut off all the Ukrainian defenses that are getting held up here. And so, then the Russians could move this way and continue, and then cut off Karakova from here, cut this highway, and this will make Karakova in very much big trouble here. And so, what we see here is the Russians basically using basically moving southwards, and Selydove is the key. Once they take Selydove, this is the gateway to Karakova, and this would put in jeopardy the Ukrainian defenses that are in this area of South Donetsk. And then once they take Kharkova, then this would jeopardize the Ukrainian defenses in Ugledar. We also have a lot of advances happening here. So I talked about, besides the battle for Selydove starting, we also talked about how the Russians have secured a new highway, which is the M50 highway here. And because they have completely captured the town of Karlovka, we got a bunch of geolocated footage of the Russians being here. The Russians raised their flags here. They raised their flags like here, in the church here. So there's a lot of footage actually from Karlovka being taken. And this is big because now the Russians have a highway that goes from their main kind of they're using Donetsk as an area as the push-off point, but now they have a highway, a highway that is unburdened that could lead to them being supplied in Selydove, Novohrodivka, instead of just going from Avdiivka and from Orcheshny to Porez. And this is where a lot of people are being, kind of worried about Ukrainian attack from the north, because if the Ukrainians attack north here and managed to cut the road here, then the Russians would have been cut off. Because, again, if you kind of zoom out a little bit, you can see this is a bit of a salient. It kind of bulges out, and it does not flatten with the rest of the front line here. But the Russians are now kind of clearing the front in the south here. So, they're hoping to basically have the front line go something like this. And then, then they'll secure their south, have this be more of a secured base here in their south here. And basically the fall of Karlovka gave them the highway to secure themselves in Selydove and Novohrodivka as they pushed towards Pokrovsk. So this was a big gain for the Russians. Karlovka has fallen. We also have to talk about how the Russians have captured Kalinova. This happened earlier in the week as they moved down along the Vochka River. They also captured Mykolaievka, which was the gateway to Selydove. So Mykolaievka has fallen. They have also captured the village of Murmansk, and are now and have also, by the end of this week, basically using, because again, the Ukrainians had defenses along the Vochachka River here because they were expecting a frontal assault. They weren't expecting an assault from the back here, and this is why we're seeing these areas collapse a lot faster. Now, it might take a bit longer now, because before, when they were clearing these villages to the west of the Vochka River here, the Russians were already secured on the eastern part of it, and so the Ukrainians were kind of pinned and were forced out. But now they've basically reached the area where the Ukrainians are still in this pocket here, and so if the Russians want to continue pushing to the south here, the Ukrainians could actually attack them from two areas. And so it's going to be a bit harder to continue pushing here unless they take Selydove and manage to kind of start pushing down here. One of the main defenses the Ukrainians have here is the town of Ukrainska here. This has a few thousands of inhabitants here, and along with the village of Gernik here. You can see that these areas have a bunch of high-rise buildings, like some terracons and such like that. And so these areas basically hold the rest of the Vochka River defenses here. And but if the Russians could take Selydove, they could get behind them and render these defenses useless. But again, so it depends on how fast the Russians could take the town of Ukrainska, for example. So some sources are saying the Russians are now in Lysyivka, or at least are trying to secure this little suburb so that they could then use that as a springboard to attack Ukrainsk. So we're basically seeing the Russians are basically reaching their where the new Ukrainian defense line. But again, defenses are only as good as manpower, and as long as the Ukrainians still don't have manpower, they can be overrun pretty quickly. But as we see, the Ukrainians are now sending reinforcements to Pokrovsk. So one thing to keep in mind is that now we might see a bit of a slowdown here. But again, we have to see, maybe that's just not enough reserves. So, so the battle for Selydove is starting. I'm betting that the Russians will probably try to continue pushing south, try to take Zelina Pershi and Zelina Jura, take these two little villages here, and kind of take Lysyivka and these fields here. So then they can then try to, outflank Ukrainska, and then from there, they could try to force the Ukrainians to give up this entire area right here, and then move the front line up to the Vochka River. Because the more they move south, the more they're able to, and the reason why they're able to take these is because the more to the west is a bit of a higher ground, so they'll have to take Ukrainska and then go behind Gernik and Kurakova here. These two towns right here. They have to get behind them because if they just continue going south here, they'll be on the lowland and the Ukrainians will be on the high ground and they'll be able to put pressure on the Russians. So, yeah. So the Russians have take the town of Galaska and Dolinovka, which were natural takes as they continue moving south. But now the focus is going to be on Selydove and Ukrainska. Because once they take Ukrainska and Selydove, they'll be able to outflank Gernik and Krivka by getting behind those two towns and then basically collapsing this entire area and have the front line kind of... Let me go up here. The goal is to basically have the front line go something like this. And then hopefully they'll be able to take Kurakova and then have something go something like this. So then, this straightens the front line, and then this will give them Selydove and Kurakova as new supply bases to continue their push to the rest of western Donbass, which doesn't have as much big, besides Pokrovsk, there's just little towns and villages here. There's nothing really here. So, and if they continue pushing this way, once this happens, this is in the future, once Kurakova and Selydove falls, they can continue pushing this way, take Andriivka, reach the Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk border, and then this could actually start taking out the Velika Novosolovka defenses here in the south here. So kind of maybe the whole point here is that they'll try to kind of flatten the front line something like this. And then, have the border be around, here or something like that. So kind of just pull the front line upwards. And then I could, continue seeing them pushing more to the, to the west here and kind of pulling the, getting behind the defenses in Zaporozhye and then making the front line just kind of move up, a couple dozen kilometers. And then, push the Ukrainians back to Zaporozhye itself. Up toward, to Pavlograd, and then up to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and the northern part of Donetsk here. So a lot of things happened in the Pokrovsk direction. There was so much gains here, and it's just wow. We'll have to see if they continue developing on their success in this coming week of September. So yeah, that's happened in Pokrovsk. A lot of gains, a lot of things to talk about. And we shall see where I talked about where the Russians will focus on. They'll try to capture the fields and the southern part of Minograd and the fortress, the trenches that are to the south of Pokrovsk. They're going to continue battling for Selydove, and then they're going to try to encircle Ukrainska here. So those are the main efforts that are going to be going on for the next week or so. Speaking of the South Donetsk area, let's talk about what's happening here. So in Krasnogorivka, there's been a slowdown in operations. We saw that the Russians have captured a few fields to the west of it, mostly this area right here. So the Russians are moving a little bit, but I guess they're just kind of standing firm here because they don't really need a push because the Ukrainians will give up these positions naturally as the Russians pull forth. So, but there's been some gains in Krasnogorivka. But the biggest gains have been in the Ugledar direction, which has been activated because one of the main brigades apparently that were defending Ugledar was moved to the Pokrovsk area allegedly. And one of the biggest changes, which I found extremely, was crazy, was the complete fall of the town of Konstantinovka. Now, before they were battling for the center. I thought the battle for the center would take 2-3 weeks because those are where the main Ukrainian defenses are. But earlier this week, we saw the Russians raising their battle flags in the western part of Konstantinovka and also, getting droned in this dacha right here. So the Russians have completely captured Konstantinovka. How did they do that? I actually don't know. Maybe the Ukrainians fell back here. They didn't want to defend this anymore. Maybe I don't know because the Russians captured the south, but they it wasn't like they outflanked them here because as far as I know, the fields here are still under Ukrainian control. So I don't know how they managed to maybe get behind the Ukrainians here, but basically the battle for the center, I guess. Or maybe, we didn't get enough updates. Maybe the battle for the center already happened and we just didn't know about it. But anyway, so Konstantinovka has completely fallen to the Russians. Along with this, the Russians have captured the dachas to the north and have captured basically everything to the south of this highway here as well. So here, and the Ukrainians have fallen back to the next defense line to Antonovka and Kartoninovka here. So Ukrainians still have, they've built up these defenses because this has been the front line for again, they're preparing for a direct assault. So, any sort of gains here will be slow. As we saw, the battle for Novohrodivka took a few months. The battle for Konstantinovka took a few months. So, to take these towns has been a very big pain, and the Ukrainians know that. They have defenses going all the way up to Uspennitska here. So, it might take a few more months to take these two towns. But again, maybe they might stop because, again, if the Russians are successful to the north here, they'll be able to force the Ukrainians to give up these defenses easily. So, maybe they're probably just here to secure Konstantinovka to secure Ugledar. But yeah, Konstantinovka has completely fallen along with the fields to the north here. We also saw in here that the Russians have basically fully secured themselves along the highway. So the Ukrainians had a big, strong defense line in on the M30 road. I believe it's here, if I remember. Yeah, you could see the Russians have completely captured this strong trench line here. And because they raised their flags here, the Russians are now moving towards the town of Vodana. And the reason why they're trying to capture Vodana is because with the capture of Vodana, they'll be able to start outflanking these coal mines, because if they could put the coal mines under siege, this prevents Ugledar from being supported like what happened in the beginning of 2023 when the Russians failed to dig Ugledar. But some pro-Russian sources are saying that these fields right here have been captured, and now they are right on the outskirts of Vodana and are ready to storm it. So we shall see if they are doing that. They're going to do that, but the Russians are basically continuously pushing. Looks like this is another trench here, but the Russians are now fully cutting off Ugledar. We're gonna see. It's kind of hard to talk about being excited about this front because it's always been about advancing through the fields here, but now. With the fall of Konstantinovka and with the fall of Vodana coming, soon, Ugledar will be cut off, and then we might finally see the final battle for Ugledar. We also saw some map sources saying that the Russians secured their gains to the west of Pavlovka, which was taken a little while ago. So they took a bit more fields to the north here. So there was that. So the South Donetsk area is also activating. It looks like they want to basically secure Konstantinovka and Vodana and Ugledar to make this be the new front line. Because they could support, they have a road going from Donetsk through Pobeba, Konstantinovka, and Ugledar. They could use this highway as a support, and the Ukrainians will kind of have to fall back towards Bushanovka, Uspenska, and then kind of use these villages as and the fields to kind of push the Russians away from their defenses here. But I think the Russians will try to take Ugledar and Vodana, but then maybe stop, and then as they wait for the Russians, see how the Russians develop in the Pokrovsk area. But it could be that the Russians slow down Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians could still be supported in the South Donetsk area. So I think they're right now waiting to see how successful the Pokrovsk direction continues to develop here. Also, as we go more to the west, there's been some small changes on the ground. The Russians have cleared the fields to the north of Starmayorsk and Orozhaina. They managed to capture these area right here. So the Russians are just kind of improving their positions around these two villages that they captured about a month ago, just kind of making their hold here a bit more secure. So a few more tree lines here were captured, so this helps secure their gains in the Starmayorsk-Orozhaina area. And then in the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians actually have made a bunch of gains here. So the Russians have cleared the pocket that was developing between Robotyne and Verbova. Basically, this pocket developed after the Ukrainians continued trying to attack towards Verbova and try to attack towards Novopokrovka. And basically, this entire area right here was liquidated by the Russians. This makes sense because the Russians, secured Robotyne. They've secured the northern part of Verbova, and basically the Ukrainians were caught in a trap, and they had to fall back towards more reliable positions. We also have some map changes showing that the Russians have taken the tree lines to the north of Robotyne. And so Robotyne is now fully secured and taken by the Russians. And the Russians will probably also take this tree line, have this continue, take this area here, and then this kind of flattens the front line. So no longer is there a salient in Robotyne. The Ukrainians have retreated to their pre-2023 defenses here. So basically, the entire 2023 offensive led to nothing here. So, but I don't think the Russians will continue pushing here. They'll flatten the front line. They pinned Ukrainian forces here, but they're not going to continue advancing towards Orekov because then that might be a bit of a, the Ukrainians have their own defenses here. There's been no changes in the Kherson front. Let us now talk about the Toretsk area, and this is where the Ukrainians are. This is where the pace of advance in Toretsk is what I was expecting in Pokrovsk, but for some reason Pokrovsk collapsed, for the most part, and Toretsk is still holding on, but they're still making gains, but small gains, and this is what I was expecting. Alrighty, so for Toretsk, one thing to keep in mind about Toretsk is there's been some slow gains here, as I mentioned, but there's been some gains nonetheless. So let's talk about them. So the first thing is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Panichnia and have completely captured the town of Druzhba. Now, this map doesn't show it, but most mappers have said that the Ukrainians have left the village of Druzhba and the village of Panichnia and have fallen back towards more positions up here in the north here. And so, with the capture of Druzhba and Panichnia, the Russians could continue using this rail line to continue pushing northwards and try to start battling for the village of Dacha and Dolinovka. Because if these two villages fall, then the Russians could outflank Toretsk from the north here and start battling up north here. So, my guess is the Russians will continue pushing along this rail line and start battling for Dacha. So, Druzhba and Panichnia are been completely captured. This allows them to continue outflanking Toretsk from the north here. However, the Russians have also broken through into the center, well, not to the center of Toretsk, but into the city proper. This high-rise building area has been completely captured by the Russians. They are still trying to clear it. The Russians have also pushed in right here and trying to enter kind of the main center of the city. They have captured this area right here. However, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold off the Russians is in this prison colony right here, this prison and this Terrakon. The Russians have captured basically this week everything, all these forests and these plantations to the west of the Terrakon that they captured. But the Ukrainians are trying to basically foil right now the battles are going on for this Terrakon and this prison right here. If the Russians could capture these two big strong points right here, then the Russians could then break into the center of Toretsk, and then the battle for Toretsk proper will begin. The Ukrainians have positions with high-rise buildings right here. They also have this giant Terrakon right here, this factory right here. So the center of Toretsk is where the Ukrainians could fall back to. So it's not like if the Russians break through this prison and this Terrakon, Toretsk is captured, but this will make the battle go on for the center of Toretsk. And as I mentioned, once they break through here, the Russians could move to the north here and take this area right here. Then the Russians, if they manage to move up here to the north through Dacha and Dolinovka, they could attack from the north here and try to storm this mine right here. And then this gives them, then from there, they could then move and clear these, low-rise residential areas and try to outflank the center of Toretsk like they're doing in Selydove. So, but right now, the Russians are getting, they've captured areas here. They've captured this area right here, and so right now the goal for next week is to capture this prison and this Terrakon, and then from there the Russians could then push towards the next Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk, which is the center and this mining factory area right here. So small gains. The Russians took Druzhba. They are continuing battling for the eastern part of Toretsk. And so the Russians are still on the southern part of Toretsk here as well. Some sources are also saying the Russians have pushed a little bit to the west of the New York salient and have captured these tree lines right here. So small gains, but this kind of puts some distance between the Ukrainians' positions, which are guarding here, and the Russian positions in New York, which they need to secure so that they could outflank Toretsk from the west here. So small gains at Toretsk, but they are slowly breaking into the town. As we go further north here, let us now talk about Chasiv Yar. So in the Chasiv Yar directions, but there's been some small gains. We haven't seen a lot of gains this past month in this area after the Russians captured the citadel. But there's been some small gains here happening. So the Russians have captured this area right here. So they've taken a small section of what they call the Novi district. So the Novi district is this entire small residential area on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. So the Ukrainian defenses are in the high-rise factory area right here in the center of Chasiv Yar. But right now, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to capture this Novi district here. So they made some small gains in this area, secured their bridgehead on the other side of the canal a bit better. But again, it's going to be, these small gains are, it's small, and it'll take a while for them to finally fully capture this. And it'll be a whole other thing entirely to reach the center of Chasiv Yar. We also saw that the Russians have started the battle for Gridivka, this small village right here, and capture this village will allow them to start trying to encircle Chasiv Yar from the north here. And what we got this week is that the Russians have entered the first houses of Gridivka and have captured this area right here. So now they're going to try to break into this village right here. So the battle for Gridivka has started. The goal obviously is to capture it fully, kind of flatten the front line with the Russians that are here. So kind of maybe flatten it here, go along the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and then from there they could then storm the Chalk Quarry, which is the main Ukrainian defenses in the north of Chasiv Yar. And if they could capture it, then they could start assaulting Chasiv Yar from the north. But in order to do that, they need to take Gridivka, which they have finally entered. So some small gains in the Chasiv Yar direction. They're slowly improving their positions, but Chasiv Yar is still far away from being captured. In the Seversk direction, the Russian Ministry of Defense says they have captured the village of Vimfka. But we have not got any map updates about that, so we'll have to see. But this does make sense. It looks like they're trying to basically have the front line go something like this, kind of flatten the front line a little bit like that. But we need to get a bit more confirmation if they have captured the village of Vimfka. In the Liman direction, the Russians have, looks like after they've basically almost captured all of Makivka, or a lot of it, the Russians are now trying to push along the fields more to the south to get closer to Nevesky. And we got some map changes saying that the Russians have captured this tree line right here, these fields right here, and basically are getting closer to, because the fields between the Russian positions, which are along this highway, and the Ukrainian positions, which are along the Zhirbets River here, there's just a bunch of fields, and this basically destroys a bunch of, it's very hard for armored vehicles to cross it. But obviously now that Makivka has been stormed, they could, and mostly captured, they can now move south and basically collapse the Ukrainian defenses here. But Makivka is still being fought over. It's not completely taken just yet, but a lot of it has been taken, and I guess the Russians want to continue pushing their luck here and pinning Ukrainian forces to the south here. So some small changes on the Liman direction. Where there's been some decent changes is in the Kupiansk direction, this area right here. Let's talk about here. We basically have we have some geolocated footage that the Russians have completely captured the village of Zhematovka here, and that this entire area right here has been captured by the Russians, and has been confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. We also, so the fields to the north of it and the village itself has been captured by the Russians. And basically with this, most sources are saying that the Russians have fully captured these three villages right here, Stimatovka, Mishidorovka, and Andriivka, and have basically captured this entire area and have moved the front line closer to the Osko River. So the capture, again, once they, now they've secured these three villages, the next place where they have to storm is Lozova, because then if Lozova falls, then they could then start moving towards the Osko River. And this is being helped by what I call the Pashana flower. So once Pashana fell, the Russians are expanding in every single direction. It's like, in Pashana. We have map changes showing that the Russians have captured these fields to the south of Pashana here. We have some footage showing that the Russians have captured these fields to the northwest of Pashana. So before they took Pashana, but they only captured maybe the fields more, around it. But now they're expanding, to the north, to the west, and to the south here. A lot of sources are now saying that the Russians are trying to take these fields right here to the south of Pashana, and then kind of flatten the front line with Berestova and Novoselivka, and basically, kind of, capture the fields to the south of Berestova. And then from here, what the Russians are hoping to do is that the Russians could attack from the east here, but also from the north, and then try to storm Lazova, and then have the front line go something like this, and kind of move the front line closer to the Oska River here. But besides that, I think the Russians want to just attack the Oska River directly. I mean, look how close they are here. I have no doubts that the Russians will probably try to do some sort of direct attack, trying to secure, probably try to capture one of these villages, because they just need to break the Kupiansk-Liman directions in two. They need to attack directly. They're only like 2-3 kilometers away from these towns, and then they could reach the Oska River and cut the front line in two. And then let's say they push here, and this is where the front line is, right? Let's kind of scroll out here. My guess is the Russians will push here, and then they'll start pushing southwards, and then try to clear, and then have a more stable bridgehead until they reach Borova. So I guess what the hope is that they'll kind of capture something like this. Have this be the new kind of, they'll push here, and then they could move south, they can move north towards Kupiansk, but either way, this could roll up the Liman and Kupiansk fronts really well for the Russians. But, again, they have to we'll have to see if the Russians were able to reach these two villages here. So the Pashana flower is blooming. The Russians have completely captured Novohrodivka, and as they're getting, day by day, they're getting closer to the Oska River. The Russians have also after years, captured the village of Sinkovka. The Russian commanders here were very incompetent. They've been battling over this village for like a year now, maybe even longer. But finally, we got some geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags in the northern part of Sinkovka. Most Russian sources are saying they captured the village fully. And I guess this was helped because they managed to capture the fields to the west of it, or to the east of it as well, a few weeks ago. So I think they could secure Sinkovka, but again, they have to, the Ukrainians are still in the forest here. They still have the town of Petropavlovka here, and there's still a lot to do before they can reach Kupiansk. But again, Sinkovka is a nice base they could push out of, but they finally captured it. But the Ukrainian defenses here are either stronger than usual, or the Russian command is more retarded than usual. But again, Sinkovka has been taken, so at least that is some progress for the Russians in the northern Kupiansk direction. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. In fact, there's been really no changes in the Kharkov direction in the last 2-3 weeks or so. It looks like most of the Russian and Ukrainians moved the forces from Kharkov to Kursk. The Ukrainians are trying to attack Luboka after the Russians dislodged them from this town, but they keep failing, trying to retake Luboka. And basically, the Volchansk area is still kind of in the same area. In the Kursk direction, is basically now in the Kursk direction, we are now seeing a slowdown in operations. The Ukrainians still have the attacking initiative, but it's completely slowed down. So in this area in Kornovo, again, I talked about what the Ukrainians wanted to take in Kursk last week, but the main thing is they wanted to encircle Kornovo. The Ukrainians are still a little bit successful in the south here. They've not pushed a lot here, but they have managed to capture the village of Krasnoborovska here, right here. So they captured this village and reached the river here, which is what they want to do, secure their have a better defense here. But they are still battling for Kamenovka here. But so they still secure themselves in the southern part of Kornovo. They still threaten it, but in the north area, they've been having some problems. So the Russians have recaptured the village of Olegovka and Kremenovka here. Or maybe, I think they've had this before, but basically the Ukrainians looked like they were trying to reach Alexandrovka, but they got cleared out, and the Russians have now retaken Olegovka here and stopped the Ukrainians from trying to encircle the Russians in Kornovo, and the Russians have also pushed the Ukrainians out of the Kornovo that's on the southern side of this river here. So the city itself, along with the northern part, is secure. So the Ukrainians are still far away from capturing the city, but they have some small gains in the south here. But also in the south, they're trying to push towards Gluzhovka and try to clear this entire area to the south of this river. But again, they only captured one village this week, so we have to see if they'll continue trying to push to the west or try to push to the north. There's been some interesting changes happening here. There's a lot of Russian sources are saying like we've recaptured the village of Nakovka and Nizhda Pernova. So the Russians like showed themselves in these giant units, saying we've recaptured these villages. So maybe they're just being, trying to say they have success here. But basically, since they are in these two villages, the Ukrainians are a bit more have made more progress here than we've anticipated. So they have the village of Ruska Pazhovka and Charovka Pernovo here, and basically they've captured a bunch of villages that are to the north, to the east of this rail line that they're using at here, and so this makes the Ukrainians a lot closer to Bolshoi-Selydovska than we expected. But the Russians do have some positions along these villages here that help push the Ukrainians away from Bolshoi-Selydovska. And so far, it looks like the Ukrainians aren't able to penetrate this last line defense before Bolshoi-Selydovska. So we'll see if the Russians will counterattack and push the Ukrainians back towards the rail line, or if the Ukrainians could try to push the Russians out of these villages here. The Russians are still battling for Mala Lonovka here, or the Ukrainians are. The Russians are holding on for dear might for this women's prison right here, and they're basically fighting for dear life here. So the battle for this village is going on very fiercely. The Ukrainians want to take it so they could continue pushing towards Lugov here, but this one little village is preventing them, which they've been battling over for the last 2 weeks, is very tough for them. In here in the south, the Ukrainians are still battling for Ruska Kamenovka here, and Borky. And it looks like basically what the Ukrainians are trying to do to the south and north here is try to push the Russians away from Suchka and have a new line of defense here to try to, not have the Suchka be, because they want this to be a logistics center and they want to secure their southern gains as they push towards Bolshoi-Selydovska. So as you can see, the Ukrainians made small little gains, but again, it's way less than what they've made before. And the Ukrainian offensive has extremely slowed down here. And it looks like it's like a stalemate. It's not a stalemate just yet. The Ukrainians are still on the attack, but it all depends on a lot of factors here. But it's slowing down, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next week or two we might see just very slow gains here, and the front line stabilizes here. So that's the end of this video. It was a long video. A lot of things happened, mostly in the Donetsk area, but and I'm excited to see what's happening next week. Will we revert back to a stalemate, or will we continue seeing massive breakthroughs? So yeah, so that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this week. Hope you guys be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates. Be sure to like this video if you liked my updates. Comment your thoughts, and I hope to see you guys next week. So aim high and wander on.